What's up, folks? Coach Bach here. I want to do some follow-up on some topics related to the force velocity curve. All right, so first, I talked about how this curve represents maximum possible force, whether it be in a single muscle fiber or in a whole muscle, or whatever section of a muscle you use. Okay, it's the same relationship. And so because that's maximal force, I said if we're trying to apply the curve to figure out muscle tension in the movement, we need the muscle to be maximally activated. Okay, but I want to clarify the curve is still relevant for submaximal activation or submaximal muscle action. Okay, because this force velocity relationship that comes from the sarcomere, right? And obviously the sarcomere is still the source of tension during submaximal action. And so the relationship is still there. The difference is this curve is just a little bit lower. All right, so let's say this represents a whole muscle curve and this is the maximal force. Well, then the submaximal curve is just going to be, a little bit lower. All right, how low depending on obviously like what the effort level is. Okay, but the same relationship holds true at submaximal intensity. So an example of applying this would be throwing, right? Let's say you go out and play catch and it's not that intense. And so you throw, maybe between 50 and 75% effort level that whole time. And in throwing, the rotator cuff is responsible for decelerating the rapid internal rotation at the shoulder that happens when you throw. Okay. And so, okay, you throw the ball 50 times, it's all submaximal throws. On those throws, are the rotator cuff muscles ever maximally activated? Honestly, I'm not sure, but regardless, let's just say they're 75% activated, right? Regardless, we know that there's going to be some significant muscle force happening because they're operating in a fast eccentric state, okay? As they are decelerating that high velocity rotation, okay? So that's just an example of like, we don't really know if the activation is maximal, but the curve is still relevant and it still informs us on the type of tension that's going to be generated in that task. Next, I've recently got a little more insight into the thoughts of people that say the force velocity curve does not apply to full body movements. Turns out what they are saying, or part of what they are saying, is that you can't just take any force and velocity measurement from a movement and just put it on this curve, okay? Which is obviously true. So it turns out some people were getting the impression that the force velocity curve, when you put exercises on there, that was referring to the ground force, right? And then the velocity of movement, like, maybe it's measured in the velocity of the barbell if we're talking about a lift, or maybe it's the velocity of the center of mass if we're talking about a jump or a sprint. Yeah, they were thinking that, you could just take those force and velocity measurements and just put them on this curve. All right. And so that's not true. To be clear, this is the force velocity relationship of muscle specifically. Okay. It informs us on muscle tension specifically at muscle shortening velocities specifically. It is not a universal force velocity relationship. Okay. You can't just take any force and any velocity measurement from any movement and just put it in this relationship. Okay. Now, I would have said that I don't think anyone has ever thought you could do that. But then, someone specifically told me that's what they thought people were doing when they put movements on the curve. Okay. And that's why it didn't really make sense to this person because, yeah, you put sprinting over here and it's like sprinting is low force. Wait, hold on. That doesn't make sense, right? And so, yeah, just we got to clarify. We're talking about muscle tension and muscle shortening velocity, not center of mass velocity, not barbell velocity, not ground force, not any other force. Okay. Specifically, it's the force-velocity relationship of muscle, okay? Now, as far as people getting confused on that, I mean, that's what you get when you just throw movements up on the curve with no other explanation, okay? So really, I think we should just abandon that practice entirely. You really have to say specific muscle at this specific point in the movement, the shortening velocity is, here or there or there. And based on that, we can say at that moment in this specific muscle, we think we're at this point on the curve. All right. You can't just throw sprinting up here with no further explanation, or squatting right here with just no further explanation. Doesn't make sense. Bad practice, bad education, or bad way to educate people. Next, speaking of this practice of putting movements on the curve, people do like to point out that this doesn't make sense, and then they'll highlight instead something else, which is load velocity relationship or load velocity profiling. Okay, so what people do is they do a movement with different weights and plot the velocity at the different weights. Okay, so here's an example with a bench press throw. And this produces a roughly linear relationship between load and velocity, or between resistance and velocity. Okay, this can be used to predict max velocity or maximum load that can be used or reached in that movement. Okay, and then people also use it to assess if someone is more force or velocity deficient and prescribe training accordingly. So I've seen people say that we should just use the load velocity relationship and not the force velocity relationship. And to that, I would say that one is not a replacement for the other. Okay. Again, the force velocity relationship is a property of muscle, and it informs us on muscle tension. Load velocity profiling is just an entirely different thing. It is not a replacement. Okay, so to the people who are saying load velocity and not force velocity, no, we can do both. The problem is we just need to understand what this thing actually is. Okay, now let's talk about strength qualities. You may have seen the force velocity curve presented like this with these strength qualities laid out along the curve. This typically is used along with that surf the curve philosophy that I love so much. All right, so let's look at these qualities. You'll see different terms used on these curves with different parameters or definitions for each one. Or sometimes there may not be any specific parameter or definition at all. All right, and that tells you that, yeah, I mean, these strength qualities are obviously pretty subjective. But okay, let's start on the left. We have absolute strength. And there is a range of bar speeds in this case that define that category. Okay, then next we have starting strength, and this is slightly faster bar speeds. Now, here's my key point. Think of the stimulus on the body. Between these two categories, is the stimulus different in any meaningful way? I would say no. Either way, it's just the nervous system sending signals, stimulating muscle tension, pulling on bones. All right. It's the same thing. One category is just a little lighter weight and a little faster velocity. Now, is the faster velocity impactful? That's the key question. And I would say if it's the fastest thing that a person is doing, then yeah, then that's something that your body has to adapt to. But if you already trained yourself by jumping or by sprinting and playing sports, all these faster activities, then lifting just slightly faster doesn't really mean anything. You're already training at much higher velocity. So slightly faster lifting is irrelevant. Okay, it just doesn't matter. It's not a meaningfully different stimulus. So now go down the list. Strength, speed. Oh, that sounds cool. Is that some unique physiological ability? No, it's just a made-up term that people use to describe lifting in a certain velocity range, or maybe a certain percentage range. All right, is it a meaningfully different stimulus on the body compared to those other two categories? Again, not if you already sprint and jump. Okay, speed strength, same story. Accelerative strength, same story. So if you already sprint, jump, plyo, play a sport, then when it comes to the weight room, you're just trying to get generally strong. You don't have to think or worry about all these strength qualities. I will say that if you want to break down strength, you can break it down into neurological strength and structural strength. And we could certainly get into a discussion on some differences in training for those two things. But putting those two components of strength on their own section of the force velocity curve would not be a part of that discussion. All right, I'm going to cut this video off here. I still have some more follow-up on the force velocity curve in the next couple videos.